Aw Yeah Comics celebrates everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, Muncie, Indiana, or Skokie, Illinois, home to our pal, Sweet Sweet Bernie. If you have children and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow them on social media. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. My love of the TV series Smallville is well documented, and there's one Smallville podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring great insight, passion, and humor to each and every episode, and the podcast will continue with more great Smallville and Superman talk even after their series coverage concludes. Listen wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On To banner, including Arrow, Star Wars, and more. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is All-Star Superboy, Chapter 4. Joining me to discuss the Young Justice event Sins of Youth is veteran Superman podcaster and returning guest, Michael Bailey. Welcome back.
You know what I like about this guest appearance and the next guest appearance is that you and I are moving forward in the timeline of Superman, because we started with like Hyper Time, then we did DC 1 Million, now we're doing Sins of Youth, and we're going to be doing something in the Loeb era next. So I appreciate that you... Like, am I going to be on the docket to talk about the Stephen T. Siegel run when you want to re-examine that? Maybe.
I wish I could say this was by design and this was some grand plan that I had, but I was pleasantly surprised when you pointed that out. It's just the way things have landed, but I love that. So if we were to create a playlist of just your appearances on the show, we'll really have a nice chronological flow.
There will be a narrative element to it. Absolutely. No, thank you so much for having me back. I have been enjoying this series particularly. You made me want to dig out and reread like the entire Reign of the Superman again, and I don't have time for that right now. When you were talking about that, but no, I'm glad you're giving Connor his due, because I feel like he has been not forgotten, but there's so many Superman family members now. And with John in the mix, it's like, how relevant is he these days? So
this is something I struggle with as well. Of course, we had a long period, and we'll be talking about this, where Connor was just off the board, erased from continuity, and thankfully he returned. But what sort of situation did he return to? Is there space for him? He's there, but is it what we want him to be?
And that's what I struggle with. Like, there's a part of me that kind of believes that certain characters belong to the era where they were the most relevant. And it's nothing against the characters. It's like Azrael over in the Bat books. They keep trying to revive that concept. And I'm like, no, he worked for that period and maybe up to No Man's Land. But after that, what does he really bring to the table? And when you take, in Connor's case, when you take him off the table for as long as they did and just not acknowledge his existence, and then replace him with a version whose origin was obviously written by an X-Men writer. He's from the future, and he's the clone of the son of... I wonder, like, is it better just to let him sit in amber and not try to bring him back? And I struggle with that. I go back and forth on it.
I totally hear you, but no, I'm glad that we're shining a light on the kid and like you said, giving him his due. And it's been an absolute blast to go through his entire arc, to revisit what I had already experienced, but then also to close some of these gaps, like the first half of the Superboy solo series, for example. So it's been a blast. I'm excited to have you here to talk Young Justice now as we get into the various teams that Superboy has been affiliated with. Now, before we dive into this too deeply, let me just ask you, and to share with our audience, you are in the midst of a really cool Superman
Oh,
podcast project at the moment, which I'm very honored to be included. And I know I'm going to be on an upcoming episode that we recorded a little while back. But what would you like to share with folks about what you got going on?
it's over on It All Comes Back to Superman Series 2. And I have to be very specific about Series 2 because there are two feeds for reasons that are just too boring to get into here. But it's called Moving Kryptonian Images. And I just started going through all the Superman films, and not just the live action ones, the animated ones too, and roped in a bunch of people to talk about it. And for the first time ever in my podcasting career, I am well ahead. So when I say all the way through April, you'll have new episodes every week, I can actually say all the way through April, you're going to have new episodes every week. And I'm finishing up the recordings now, but it's been a blast. And I think after this, I'm going to leave Superman movies alone. I am so glad that I waited until I was done with the four Christopher Reeve films before listening to your series, because I don't like to accidentally absorb something, because we covered them in two completely different ways. So, but no, I was really happy to have you on for the episode. You're going to be talking about Superman Doomsday with me, and yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Reaction has it. I'm noticing an uptick in listenership as it moves on. So I'm kind of hoping that this will bring the show to a different level, but mostly it's just to celebrate the new movie.
Yeah, it's great. I encourage everyone to check it out. I love that you're going movie by movie leading up to the new one. And yes, I have found, particularly when we covered the Snyder films and the Reeve films, that uptick that you were mentioning. There's always a lot of interest, but also to your point about them kind of leaving it alone, because you look at the numbers and it's like, oh, what else can I do with these movies? But at the same time, you want to let those episodes stand, and you don't want to go back to that well too much. So I identify with all of that.
I mean, I'm as thorough as Luke Bug, the Geek of Steel, and I talked about Brainiac Attacks. And
yeah,
if you've never seen Brainiac Attacks, I'm going to just say this. Just imagine that it's a dream that Tim Daly Superman had. And then it'll make a whole lot more sense.
I still have not watched it. Eventually I will. And actually, maybe your episode will be the opportunity for me to do that.
I can't recommend it, but I can't say not to either. It's like, dude, it's, I know that's weird, but it's different.
Yeah, I'll hit it. And like I said, I think your episode will be the time. So when I say that we're here to talk about Young Justice, lest anyone get confused and think I'm referring to the more recent animated series, we are talking about the 1998 to 2003 comic book series by Peter David and Todd Nauck, which ran for 55 issues and various specials. Now, at some point in time, whether it's on Digging for Kryptonite or Patreon feed or whatnot, I suspect that I will revisit the entire series, but I knew for purposes of this Con-El event, I wouldn't have the time or space to do that. And so you and I conferred, if we're going to talk about Young Justice, what do we zero in on here? And we had a meeting of the minds. I think we both had the instinct that the Sins of Youth event, where the adult and teen heroes of the DCU swap ages, made the most sense. I think it's the arc or the event that, if you were familiar with the series, or even if you just kind of had a passing awareness, that's probably what you might think of first when you think about Young Justice in that period of time. And of course, we have some really critical business there in terms of Con-El and Superman. So I think it will lend itself well to this conversation. But let me just ask you, while we're here, your experience with the Young Justice series as a whole, because we've exchanged some messages about this, and I think you and I kind of have a similar affinity for it. So what was your experience with this series?
I was there from the beginning. I was there from the JLA World Without Grown-Ups 2-issue prestige format miniseries written by Todd DeZago, who was originally going to write this title, and then something happened and they went with Peter David. I'm not quite sure the whole thing behind that. But yeah, that 2 issues and the secret girl frenzy 5th week. Like, I say these things and people who are familiar with that era are like, oh yeah, I remember that. Other people are like, what are you talking about? But all the girl frenzy 5th week event from 1998, where they focused on different women of the DC universe. There was a Lois Lane special too. And I loved this book from the moment it started. And I was so mad when it got canceled. And it was my first time having a beef with Dan DiDio about something.
Not the
Now, that
last,
is not to
probably.
say that is not to say that I did not come to like the Geoff Johns Teen Titans book. One can happen and the other can follow, but I loved this book. I loved these characters, particularly Connor and Robin were my two jams, because I was there at the beginning of Tim Drake as well. So I felt like I was following these characters into, and I have to give DC credit. JLA at this point in 1998, when the series started, was a brand. It was a thing DC stuck on books to sell them. And they didn't do that with this. They just called it Young Justice. And I think the book benefited from that.
I agree. No, you're right. They could have very easily called this JLA Junior.
Yeah.
Which ends up being the title of one of the Sins of Youth one-shots.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm with you. Like yourself, I was there from the jump, and it starts in 98, and again, still relatively early in my comic book journey. And as I've talked about, I wasn't reading the Superboy solo series at the time. I would, I guess, very shortly after this point in time, but I wasn't then. So this was, I would say, for a period of time, my main exposure to Superboy outside of appearances that he made in the Superman titles. But starting with Superboy and Robin and Impulse, and then of course the team would grow. You mentioned Secret, Wonder Girl, Arrowette, Empress, and so on. But I was a fan from the jump. I bought and read it monthly all the way through. Like yourself, was really upset when it was canceled. Like I said, we're focusing on Sins of Youth, but I did go back and I reread just the first issue of the main Young Justice series just to refresh my memory and get back into that world. And oh man, what a delight. It was so good. And how do I put this? I don't want to put down the Kiesel Grummett Superboy run that we spent a lot of time talking about, runs, I should say. But I guess one of the things that came up in our discussion, especially of their first run that they did on the Superboy title, is that I don't know that attempts at humor really landed for me. Yet, even just rereading one issue of Young Justice, there were a number of legit chuckles that I had as I was reading it. And maybe the biggest one of all is how the team gets its name in the first issue, where they're talking to a news reporter and Impulse says, "We're young, just us." Like just the three of them, young, just us. And the reporter thinks, "Oh, Young Justice." And we have this back and forth. And it brought back so many memories because I remembered laughing at that as an 11-year-old reading it for the first time. And I do feel like this was probably one of the earliest instances of me kind of being like, oh, comics, obviously the name suggests it, but like, oh, comics can be funny. Like they can legit make you laugh. And so I was so happy to be back in that world, and we'll do more with it in the future, but great memories that came back.
Well, let me ask you this, because you were about 11 years old when this book came out, like you said. That must have been such a different experience that I had, because I was in my 20s by that point. So now with characters like Tim Drake, who was 14 when he was introduced, and I was 14 when he was introduced, there's that feeling of kind of growing up with this character. But you must have really felt like you were growing up with these characters, because by the time you like ended middle school and entered high school, Teen Titans starts. And I don't know who said it. This isn't original to me, but that's what somebody compared when they were talking about the differences between Young Justice and Johns' Teen Titans, is that this is junior high or middle school now, because apparently junior high doesn't exist anymore. And Teen Titans was high school. And that's a really good way to look at it, because they're not as mature in this. And sometimes the humor, I'm sorry, Mighty Endowed did not age well for me personally, but I love Peter David. I love his Hulk run. I was lukewarm when I finally got to his Aquaman run, because it felt like a lot of the same beats from his Hulk run. But at this point in 98 when I was all in on Peter David. So revisiting it is one of those things where it's like, oh, that doesn't land the same way. But overall, there's that feeling of he's got such great voices for all of these characters. Everybody's distinct, everybody's different. Impulse in this book is nothing like Impulse in his own book. But are you the same around your friends as you are around the people you're at home with? So it all made sense to me.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. And I like the whole junior high school perspective. The other thing too, I had the huge benefit with Young Justice of knowing next to nothing about Teen Titans history. And so I didn't go into this book in 1998 being like, why aren't they the Teen Titans? And where are the typical Teen Titans characters? I had none of that in my head. Like, I was just able to take this for what it was. We have these young heroes of the DC universe and they're going to work together. I'm glad that reading Young Justice, I was just there for that and seeing in particular Superboy interact with this group. Now, this was not the first team that he was a part of.
No.
And I've been saying this in these episodes. I haven't forgotten, and I won't call them Ravagers again this time, but there was a short-lived series before this one, before Young Justice, that ran for 19 issues. It was called Superboy and the Ravers, where Superboy joins up with these aliens. They attend this intergalactic rave that changes locations and they can teleport in and out of it. They have stamps on their hands that also function as translators, and just a lot of alien brawls and whatnot that they get swept up in. And I had very little knowledge or even awareness of this because this came out after Kiesel and Grummett left Superboy the first time after issue 30. And Kiesel was one of the writers on Superboy and the Ravers, along with Scott Matson, I believe. And Paul Pelletier was our primary artist on it. But I wasn't even reading the Superboy book at the time. So, I really wasn't dialed into Superboy and the Ravers. I must have seen it on the shelf at the store at some point. Maybe I saw a house ad here or there. It was never collected. It's almost entirely absent from the app, except for the one issue of Ravers that ties in very loosely with the Meltdown arc from the Superboy title when Ron Mars was on it. So it's one of these things, very obscure. I went out and I bought the entire series on eBay. Was it worth the $40 I spent on it? No, not really. But I have it. What's your history with this one?
So in the fall of 1996, I made the decision. If you're looking at you call it your Superman fan journey. I have had to come up with a different term for that because I feel now like that you've staked that term out. My career, as I like to call it now, as a Superman fan, I joke that I signed a contract that I was going to buy literally everything that Superman was associated with Superman from then on. That's when I started buying the Steel series. Now, luckily, it was right at the start of the Christopher Priest run, so I came onto that book at a really good time. And so I was buying Superboy, and I don't really know how to describe this. When I moved to Georgia in the summer of 1996, or in 1995, I got involved in this friends group that was mostly guys, and they were terrible. It was just like hanging out with these guys was not a pinnacle of my early 20s. And one of them, who I'm still friendly with now, opened up a comic shop and made the worst business decision ever of letting us all hang out there. If you hear stories of comic shops where it's just a bunch of guys hanging out and being really obnoxious, this was that. And I was the Superman guy. And there was a point where, like, every comic shop I was at, I was like one or two of the Superman guys. Like, there wasn't like a bunch of us, and we all didn't really talk to each other for some reason. But I started buying this, and they just gave me endless crap over it. And at the time, I remember at least enjoying it, especially when you get further into the series, because the hero character is tied to the dial H for hero concept. And it's revealed that who he is as his superhero is different from his human form, because Sparks takes a liking to him. And when he's human, it's alluded, it's not said outright because it was still 1996, that he's gay.
Right.
And I was just like, wow, that's an interesting concept. And you have Half-Life, who's this 1950s character. Having said all of that, this is a teenage book about rave culture written by men who are well into their 30s. I don't know if that was the best idea.
So it's funny, a couple of things. In one of our prior episodes, I mentioned the ravers, and my guest said, "Oh, they're big partiers," and I laughed it off. I hadn't yet really looked at the issues. I didn't realize that ravers was meant literally. I don't know what meaning I was expecting, but yeah, it's an intergalactic rave. Like, they go to parties. So there's that. And then I had posted a picture of the first issue on social media, and my best buddy from law school, he messaged me and he was like, "Oh, I love that series." And I'm like, "Great." He goes, "It's not particularly good." He goes, "But I love it." And I said, "Hey, we all have stuff like that means something to us. It hits us at the right time, formative part in our journey, whatever the case may be." The thing that I guess I'm most baffled by, I think you hit the nail on the head with your question about, tackling this culture from these creators. But I guess, I don't know, if you're going to do a spinoff of Superboy, and by the way, the fact that they even did is amazing, but I don't know, it's just kind of a curious choice to go this route. I mean, because I was saying to myself, we just covered the solo series, and as you well know, you have such a big shift when Kiesel and Grummet return, and the setting shifts to Cadmus. So we go from Hero of Hawaii to Agent of Cadmus. It's, like I said in that episode, not night and day, but it's a big shift, to the point where if instead of Superboy and the Ravers, they had done a spinoff, a Cadmus set spinoff, and you have Guardian and Newsboy Legion and that whole crew, and Superboy's doing missions with them, I think that would have felt like a more natural spinoff. This was just very surprising to me.
This was an era of DC, 1996, 1997, and especially and into 1998, where they were experimenting a lot. If you look at like the books that were coming out at that time, you had a book called Scare Tactics, which was about this hard rock band that is literally a bunch of monsters. And in fact, if you look in the back issues, you'll see a whole bunch of those plus books, like Superboy plus somebody from Scare Tactics. They tried to make fetch happen with that. And you had a book called Major Bummer about a slacker, because it was the 90s. And you had Young Heroes in Love, which tried to like reintroduce the romance comic back into existence. And this was them tackling raves. And I've never been to a rave. I was invited to go one time when I was in high school. Me and my friends were at the Rocky Horror Picture Show midnight showing, and these two girls came up to us and asked us if we wanted to go to a rave, but my friend Ben didn't feel like driving there. So I guess I missed out on experiencing what a rave is. I'm sure if they had done this in like the 2000s or 2010s, it would have been a bunch of people doing Molly and people with, like pacifiers and glow sticks and in the background. But it was them trying to jump on a cultural bandwagon that, I don't say this to be snarky, a book no one asked for. No one said, "Please give us a Superboy book where he's hanging out with yet another group of young superpowered people, and it's all hooked up to a rave, an intergalactic rave that you get with a hand stamp that comes through your clothes."
Yeah, it's wild. I suppose too. No, your point is very well taken, and that context about what else DC was publishing at that time, I think, does help this track a bit better. And it ran 19 issues, almost 2 years. That's not nothing. So
no,
I guess there was some audience. There you
6 feet from me right now. I still have the original issues that I bought as they came out.
Yeah.
So
I guess the other thing, I always think of spin-offs in the comic book sense, but even just thinking about television shows and whatnot. And I guess when I think of a spin-off, I guess to me, the more effective ones are the ones that I'm more interested in, or when there's a more natural segue. Like there's something introduced and then, okay, we're going to follow this thread or this character or whatnot. But I know, I guess Sparks, the character Sparks, was somewhat of connective tissue, but it just sort of felt like we're plopping Superboy. And then I only ended up, I'll be honest, man, I really can only get through a few issues. I read
I don't blame you.
most of the first 4-part arc called House Rules. And then I skimmed through, or at least flipped through most of the rest. And, like Superboy pops in and out. I think it might be the 3rd issue of the series. He's MIA for almost the entire thing. And then he teleports in towards the climax. He's like, oh, sorry, guys. Like I had to help with Final Night. And it's like, okay. So
yeah, and then it gets into like they all go on a road trip. And as you said, it deals with the meltdown story that Ron Mars was writing at the time because they had to deal with that. And it's just, they tried their best. I have to give Kessel credit for trying to keep Sparks alive, because Sparks was introduced in the Adventures of Superman annual during the Bloodlines event.
Oh, Bloodlines again.
And she was part of the Blood Pack, which was a 4-issue series that teamed up a bunch of those characters with each other. And then she was here, and it's just like I don't want to say they're trying to make fetch happen, but it seemed like they were really trying to make this character. And to be fair, at the time, like how many young female characters were there in comics? I mean, Arrowette, as who we're going to be talking about somewhat in Sins of Youth, she was a character introduced in Impulse. As Mark Waid exploring, well, what would it be when a stage mother? And if you look at her outfit, she looks like Starlight from The Boys in her original outfit.
Oh.
And the whole stage mother pushing her out there and making her do this, like, there's connective tissue there that I don't think anybody realizes. So, but it's just not it's again one of those books where if someone's like came up to me and they had all 19 issues, they're like, hey, I found Superboy and the Ravers, should I read this? It'd be like, expectations low. Just go in like that. You might enjoy yourself. But I'm not going to sit there and go, yeah, man, you got, like, it's integral to Connor's journey, man.
That's the thing. Yeah, I would far quicker direct people to the Superboy solo series and those various runs. Our mileage varied on each of those periods of that title, but I would still direct people to that or to Young Justice. But it's out there, it exists. I wanted to spend at least a few minutes because there are some fans out there, people who remember it, and it is. No, not a pivotal juncture in his journey, but it was a team he was a part of, and before Young Justice. And you mentioned the road trip arc. I did read the final issue of the road trip storyline because they landed in Metropolis and they encountered the electric blue Superman. And it was an interesting issue because this is when Superman is still figuring out these new powers and not having an easy time of it. And so Superboy takes it upon himself to don a Superman costume and call himself Superman to try to fill in. And it was interesting.
Yeah. Oh man, you just brought that memory back too. God, I got to revisit the Electric Blue era at some point. I mean, we're getting to it on the show, but I don't know when the FCTC is coming back, so I may just read it on my own to memorize. Because I remember towards the end of that, I was just like, man, I'm going to be glad when this is over. But now with everything that's happened to Superman since then, it's just like, man, good times.
I had a lot of fun revisiting it. I still struggle though with Millennium Giants. That's the only real part of the storyline where I'm like, oh man, I still am not all the way on board with that. But the rest of it was really fun to revisit.
I struggle that Superman Forever is not on the app.
Don't get me started on that. So Young Justice Sins of Youth is a 5th week event from March 2000. That hits relatively early in that 55-issue run of Young Justice. I think it picks up after issue 18 or so of the Young Justice series. So we have 2 bookend issues. We have Sins of Youth 1 and 2. There's Superboy 74, which, as we talked about last time, is both the conclusion of the Evil Factory storyline from the Superboy title and a chapter in Sins of Youth. There's also a Secret Files issue, and then a bunch of these one-shots. So we specifically focused on the Superboy Senior, Superman Junior one-shot, but we also had Aquaboy Lagoon Man, JLA Jr., Batboy and Robin, Kid Flash Impulse, Star Woman and JSA Jr., Wonder Girls, and Secret and Dead Boy. So that was sort of what this event consisted of. And in terms of the storyline, we have Contessa and the Agenda pulling the strings here and trying to cause chaos and confusion and turn public opinion against the young heroes of the DC universe, with an ultimate aim of then replacing them with this genetically engineered master race created by the Agenda and the Cadmus facility that they've taken over. And what really gets things going here is she brings in Clarion to cause this confusion that we talked about. And he initially de-ages the older heroes of the DC universe. And then you have Doiby Dickles, former sidekick of Golden Age Green Lantern Alan Scott, who whips out this gizmo, and he's a member of Old Justice. He whips out this gizmo to try to reverse the effects, while Clarion sends out another one of these blasts. And it's this intersection of magic and science that results in our adult and teen heroes switching ages. And then we go off into these one-shots where they pair up. And then, of course, by the end of this, everyone is back to their normal age on Earth. Yes. Which means that we have Lobo coming in for an appearance at the very end of this as a teen. So that's just broad rundown of what's going on here. But yeah, I mean, what overall impressions of this? How did it hold up for you?
So it's funny because I will always associate this series with pain, and not because I thought it was bad, but I got these issues. Not to go into it too much. When I was born with like 5 hernias for various reasons. And when I was 4, I had to have surgery to repair an umbilical hernia, which is the worst hernia you can get. And when I was 24, I was just moved in with my wife, girlfriend at the time, but wife now. And we were doing something and it popped and I had to have surgery. And I read these as I was on my week of recovery. So there's this, as you could probably relate to a certain extent, given your own recent medical adventure.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember, because I also remember it was the same time that they introduced the new Fortress of Solitude in Superman, the Man of Steel number 100. So what my overall impression is that it is fascinating to read this now, understanding the socio-political climate of that era and what really led to this story. Because the story is a slow burn. You have Old Justice, and we haven't mentioned who's part of Old Justice. Old Justice is Doiby Dickles, who was old in like the 40s, but he's been out in space all this time. So, time being relative and all that. But you have the elderly Mary Girl of 1,000 Gimmicks, who is the sister of Sylvester Pemberton, who is the Star-Spangled Kid. And you have the Cyclone twins, who were the children of the Golden Age Red Tornado. And they come basically because these kids today, with their hula hoops and their Dan Fogelberg records, they're just out of control. And as I was reading this, I'm like, oh yeah, that was a thing because of Columbine. Like 1999, Columbine happens. And suddenly everybody is blaming Marilyn Manson and violent video games. And there's like this whole thing that we can't trust these kids are kicking time bombs. And Peter David turned that into an event. And I'm fascinated by that from reading it now.
100%. It's one of those things, obviously, even as a kid reading it, I was aware of Columbine, but kind of that entire backdrop and the way it's being used here, I think a lot of that probably went over my head at the time, But yeah, reading it now, it's like, oh yeah, I mean, that's what they were tapping into, because it really goes beyond. I mean, yes, the context for it here are these super powered youths.
Mm-hmm.
But still, it's this larger idea of the kids, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
danger, the risk that they pose, and these influences and whatnot. So yeah, I was really, really fascinated by that. And hand in hand with all of that, to kind of turn the tide back, right? And sort of speak up for themselves, they hold a rally for justice in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. And it's just, yeah, I mean, I love, this is the thing about Peter David, is that he's very good at weaving in like hard topics to talk about into his stories and still make them feel like superhero stories. There's an Incredible Hulk issue that deals with capital punishment. There's another Hulk issue that deals with AIDS. And when you're looking at what led into this, like Arrowette is not a hero during this whole thing because she's quit because her teacher was killed by, I think it was an ex-boyfriend who just snapped. And if you read that issue now, the gun control element of it is laid on pretty thick. But he used that to talk about guns and his feelings on gun control. And I actually really liked the lead into this. And even the execution of the ending. I was just like, this is really well written. This is it. There is a through line, there's humor, there's goofy moments. I completely forgot that Contessa was involved with this.
Dude, I talked about this last week when we were going through all of this stuff with the Evil Factory and the agenda, and I was like, she was running this? Like, I totally forgotten. But it was a very pleasant surprise.
Yeah.
But no, I'm with you. Yeah. While I didn't reread those issues leading into Sins of Youth,
Yeah.
those events are referenced. The Arrowette business that
Yes.
you talked about. There's a battle in a hideout that's located within Mount Rushmore, and they end up causing this property damage. So yeah, there are numerous instances that are calling up these questions about their activities. And also, to your point, when you get to the end, and not to jump ahead, but I think the ultimate message of this, I liked that it wasn't one side was right, one side was wrong. It really comes down to that both our older and younger generations need to work with each other and learn from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was great. And especially when you get into that Superman, Superboy special, which we'll talk more, but there's a lot of great stuff in there. But there is a moment where you really see that Superboy and Superman are seeing things from the other's perspective, right? Where Superboy, now aged up, is aware of the responsibility and how there's really no margin for error in that particular role. He can't kind of goof around and mess up like he can as Superboy. But then from Superman's perspective, as a teenager, saddled with these powers that he didn't have when he was actually a teenager himself. Like, I love that angle. He's really struggling because he has less power than he does as Superman. He's getting his ass kicked all over Metropolis, but he has way more power than he did when he was actually a teenager. But he recognizes it's like, yeah, the weight of that expectation of people expecting you to be Superman and you're not. And so I love that common ground they were able to find. Like, it really, for a fun gimmick of switching ages, it really did allow for some character exploration. It was really very well done.
And that's the thing, is that Peter David's strengths as a writer are character and dialogue. And those can carry, I mean, I'm in no way trying to diminish Todd Knox's contribution to this, because I love Todd Knox's artwork. He was one of the reasons why I loved Young Justice so much.
And he did virtually every issue. Yep. I believe the only one he missed was because he was on his honeymoon. I remember that from the letters page. They were like, Todd's off on his honeymoon. Yes, so good.
But he had, like when I close my eyes and I think of Superboy, and recently I discovered, I think you were talking, like, once you tweeted out about Connor and got like it blew up and you got like 500 likes on it or something like that. Yeah, same thing happened to me last week. Because when I close my eyes and think of Superboy, I think of Tom Grummett.
Yeah.
And when I think of Robin, I think of Tom Grummett. And when I think of Impulse, I think of Humberto Ramos. Right? And yet Todd Knock has distinctive and really good versions of all of those characters that sit just under all of those. And it's kind of fascinating. Like when I cracked it, because I have the digital trade, and because I didn't feel like digging into the comics, and I swiped over and I saw like the first shot of everything. I'm like, yeah, I remember now. This is gonna be good.
When I first started going to New York Comic Con well over a decade ago, the first sketch I ever obtained was from the late great Darwin Cook, and it's one of my most prized possessions, certainly in the comic book space. And right after that was Todd Knock, and I ended up getting a Kid Flash from him, and before that, Superboy. But interestingly, and I posted this on social media recently, it was Superboy in his Teen Titans look, which, like I said, just showed where I was in my fandom at the time. If I were to read, and I love the piece and it's hanging above my head, it's out of frame, but it's back there. But it's like, if I were to do that again, I would 1000% have had him draw the classic original Superboy look. But I love that piece I love his stuff. It's so good. And I'm glad he's still, not that long ago, he drew the final issue of that Geoff Johns Justice Society of America series that focused on Stargirl. So I'm glad to see him still doing DC stuff.
Yeah, and the one thing that I forgot about this series that was such a big deal at the time is that for a while the Superboy running around Young Justice was not Connor.
I know you get this. So we have this rally for justice in DC. What could go wrong? And then you and then you have this reveal. All of a sudden, Superboy starts ranting about how you can't trust these heroes. They're terrible. And it turns out it's Match. It's his clone Match. And then you have the real Superboy jumping over from the events of the Evil Factory where the Agenda had taken over Cadmus, and he shows up and they duke it out and whatnot. But and then I talked about this in our last episode. I haven't actually read these issues, but I know the recent Suicide Squad ongoing series that basically pulled the same trick, I believe, where it seemed like we were dealing with Connor, but then it was actually Match. And then the real Connor shows up. So hey, if it works once, do it again.
Hey, good. You don't throw good ideas away, is what I'm saying. But I remember that being at the time like that's why these aren't excuse the pun, matching. It wasn't him at all. And I'm like, wow, what another slow burn to do in the background that it's the Superboy that kisses Wonder Girl is not Superboy.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So do you know offhand, like how many issues was it actually of the Young Justice title that it wasn't him?
I would have to go back and reread. I only read the trade because the entire trade is the Sins of Youth. Thankfully, the trade also includes Superboy number 74, which ties into everything. And that's when I reading that the other night and going, what is the Contessa? Oh, yeah, the Contessa was... Because when I think of the Contessa, I think of her having the child and being like whisked off stage. And then it's revealed during President Lex that he had her killed.
Yeah.
So to me, Contessa's either unconscious or dead. And then here she is being the big bad of this whole Evil Factory storyline over in Superboy. Now I'm like, man, I really got to reread that second Kessel Grummet arc.
I know. It was like this whole other chapter. Yeah, I know. It was really amazing. And then, of course, you have all this business. This ties in with the fact that at this point in time, Superboy's cellular structure was locked and he was permanently stopped at age 16, such that in the first Sins of Youth issue, when everyone swaps ages at the end, Superboy's just standing there, still his 16-year-old self. And then over in the pages of Superboy, Serling, Rocket is able to unlock this because essentially these competing forces, the blend of science and magic that's trying to age him up and this locked cellular structure are at war with each other. And so it's tearing him up. And she's able to solve this problem. And then he emerges as the adult Superboy with the cape that magically appears and whatnot. So that solves that little bit of business, which this is more of a bigger, I guess, Connell question. But I don't know. Do you feel like that whole stuck at 16-bit I don't know, paid off? Was it worth? I don't know how
No,
much mileage they really
I
ever got
think
out of that.
it was one of those things where when they did it, it made sense for the storyline they were doing it with, but it's not one of those bits of business that has a longevity because him, the Peter Pan influence of Connor cannot be denied. I mean, he does the whole second star to the right straight on till morning in that last issue of Adventures of Superman before he goes to Hawaii, and he attributes it to James T. Kirk because, of course, he does. And I think so when they undid that, I was like, oh yeah, that's when they undid that. I think my bigger problem with that issue was there was absolutely no reason to kill Tana Moon at all.
Okay, so you haven't heard our last episode yet.
Okay.
I'd say a good 10-15 minutes is just all of the problems that we had with that. So I've said my piece, but yes, please go for it.
Okay. I remember it happening at the time and just accepting it as a part of the thing. And that's actually when I remembered that, I was just like, yeah, because at some point this was an accepted trope in literature, essentially, but especially comics. Killing the girlfriend to somehow further for shock value and to somehow further the male character's story and development used to be a thing. And then Gail Simone wrote her Women in Refrigerators essay, and suddenly we're talking about it. And even the guy that wrote the issue that inspired that agrees that, yeah, we needed to move away from that. Because I got to interview Ron Mars last year and asked him about it. I approached it very delicately because I didn't want to come in hot. But he was just like, no, I totally see what she was saying. She was absolutely right. And so I have problems now as an adult, like rapidly approaching 50, with Tana and Superboy's relationship anyways. If you listen to Jeffrey and I talking about those Superboy issues on From Crisis to Crisis, we're both like, dude, she's in her 20s. He is weeks old, but looks like a 16-year-old. This is not cool. Yeah. And then to bring her back only to kill her, I was just like, this is just for shock value at the end of this thing. You did not, there was nothing about the plot that demanded it. And it was just like one of those things that he's an adult when it happens. So it's almost like this is like a moment that ages him. And I'm just like, Carl, I love you. But this is just one of those things that I can't get behind at all. Just at all. I mean, I was listening to you and your guest talking about all of the relationships they tried to saddle him with at the beginning with Knockout. We had a field day with Knockout too. Don't get me wrong. We were just like, none of this is all right. The only one I even saw was Roxy, but that's only because Kessel did a great job making her a fully fleshed out character.
Yep.
And when we got like to the point where she was joining the police force, I was just like, she likes Superboy because Superboy represents the teenage years she never got because her dad forced her into an adult role very early on. So that was the only crush that I was just like, this kind of makes sense. But no, I read that and I was just like, man, I remember this happening, but I am not okay with any of this.
So I agree with all of that. And we basically got at all of that in our last episode. But the thing I just kept coming back to, and it still bothers me, is just how she was just brought back for this purpose. That's the thing. A lot of these other issues would still be at play, but that more than anything else, I just found very, very difficult.
Because I felt that all of the Hawaiian supporting cast got a really good send-off in their final issue. They were all moving on with their lives. The only one that was sticking around was Double X, but that's just because he's connected to Cadmus anyways. So that makes sense. To bring her back and then just kill her seems almost cruel. Like if you liked that character and you were excited that she came back and it was only to watch her die. And It's almost like they did it just to get that cover to Superboy number 75, where it's the coffin and the
Yep.
and the jacket draped on the coffin, and it's just like, oh god,
Yeah.
a rare misstep.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. But as far as Superboy being aged up, I mean, we mostly see this play out in that Superman Superboy Sins of Youth special. And like I said, the fact that they can see things from each other's perspective was great. I mean, I don't know, what else stood out to you about that issue? Of course, we get the big step forward in terms of Superman revealing his secret identity to Superboy, which Superboy already knew. He learned it while he was in Hyper Time. We had a couple of issues after that where he approached, in one issue of Superboy, he approached Superman. In an issue of Superman, he approached Clark and was kind of hinting around at it, but it still wasn't something that was acknowledged between them. And then we get this big step forward. But yeah, I mean, what else stood out to you about this issue?
I was not crazy about the art.
No.
And that's unfortunate because it's like, it's not bad. It's just when you're coming from Todd Knock and Tom Grummett, and then you get this, it's just like, oh, and you don't want to say it's a step down because that's an insult to the artist who probably poured their heart and soul into drawing the book. Most people don't draw a book just for a paycheck, especially in the early 2000s. You're trying to apply your craft. What I liked more than anything was the comedic moments, like he's trying to get Connor to call Lois and do the beef bourguignon with ketchup thing, and he keeps screwing it up.
Beef booger or whatever. Yeah.
That I was like, this is legitimately funny. This is great. And Lois just is on the other end going, yeah, whatever, Clark, that's fine.
Yeah.
But it was that thing you talked about earlier of Superman and Superboy had a relationship, but they were never close. Unlike the Bat family of the 90s, which were constantly teaming up and talking to each other and having relationships, the Super family came together only when the events called them to come together. And I think that's why I'm having trouble with the Super family now, that everyone's constantly in each other's business, because I'm like, no, send Connor off to Hawaii, send John off to Washington, D.C., have Supergirl living in Midvale. And then when you want a big event, bring them all together. And they're that type of family. They're not the type of family that has Sunday dinner. They're not the Blue Bloods type of family. They're more like holidays and special events. And I really liked that they got time together. Because it wasn't like the Young Justice cartoon series where Superman was a jerk.
Right. Yes.
Man, I have never been more disappointed in Clark
than
when he just flies off. I'm like, no, this doesn't feel right. But just that whole thing of him realizing what it is from Connor's perspective, because Connor has this like devil-may-care, lighthearted, I'm a 16-year-old looking at babes type of attitude. But deep down, he knows that he's the man. He's the one on deck to take over this, which is why the hypertension storyline was so good, because it explored a Connor that couldn't deal with that.
Right.
And the world turned against him. So, but I think it's very ironic that I'm reading this Superman in a 16-year-old body a week before it is announced that we are once again going to have a 15-year-old Clark Kent in the Superman uniform in Action Comics, written by Mark Waid. I'm not saying that you manifested the secret style into existence, but I'm not saying it.
We joke about this a lot. If nothing else, not that I normally put stock in things like this, but if nothing else, I feel like just putting it out there into the universe. Maybe there's something to be said for that. What do I think it actually is? I think it's that we have someone like Mark Waid, who clearly has affinity for that chapter in Superman lore, now has the opportunity to tell the kinds of stories that he wants. And so ultimately, if I have to be honest with myself, I'm sure it was just a coincidence. But there is always that part of me that's like, who at DC is listening? Somebody's listening. Just reveal yourself. It's all right. We can all be friends. You could come on the show. It'll be great.
I mean, there was a period of From Crisis to Crisis where Geoff and I staged an email writing campaign for them to collect Dark Knight over Metropolis. And then it finally happens and everyone's like, it worked. I'm like, no, there's a Superman Batman movie about to come out. That had more to do with it than us.
Well, as I've been joking about, well, not really joking, but as I've been saying on social media, Conduit is next, everybody. Just stay tuned. We're going to do whatever we can. We'll make this happen. Before this podcast is done, Conduit will be back.
But I really enjoyed watching them spend time together and have like really deep conversations. It was kind of funny watching Clark kind of deal with having as much power, because I think it's funny to think now that readers coming into Superman now will find the concept of Clark not having all of his powers as a teenager weird, where to us, it is the most natural thing on the face of the planet. And it's just, that's just how comics are. But I really liked just Connor trying to literally man up. Like in seeing the weight of being Superman is on Superman. And it's why Fifth Week events in general were hit and miss. Some of them were really good. The Tangent Universe ones, excellent group of comics. The this one, Sins of Youth. And then you had like the JLA one where it was like JL Amazons and JL Aliens, and it's just like, now you're doing it just to do it. Now, this feels forced, but I think with this one they really used this as a chance to actually explore these characters. I didn't read the other ones because, my God, there were a lot of them. I forgot how many there were.
There were a bunch. Going back to the art for a second, I just was skimming through them, and the artist on the Secret Dead Boy one shot, Mike Oming, did it. Yeah. I was like, oh, this is great. So yeah, like I said, I think we're going to be spending more time with Young Justice down the line, and when I get there, I'll reread all of these. But no, art aside on the Superman Superboy issue, I really did like it. And you mentioned those heart-to-heart conversations, and it's towards the climax when Superboy is talking about how, I realize that, there's no room for error. And Superman's like, I make plenty of mistakes. And, and he says, like, one of them was not telling you who I am. And I loved his explanation, because he's like, part of it was my privacy. Like, I wanted to maintain my privacy. And that tracks with what we saw in that issue of Superman by Loeb and McGinnis, where Connell visits the farm. But he's like, but also it felt like if I brought you in close, that like my days are numbered, like I'm training my replacement. And so I love that from Clark's perspective, but then from Khan's perspective, where he says, it's like, I'm not replacing you anytime soon. And it's such a great payoff to where the character started, right? From that debut of don't ever call me Superboy. Right. And in this Sins of Youth special, he articulates like, I want the Superboy name to mean something. Like, that's what I'm here for. That's what I'm here to do. So I just, from both perspectives, it was really very satisfying. I liked it a lot.
I just think that when you read it in read the Sins of Youth #1, and then you just read this, and then you go to the finale in the second issue, I felt like Peter David did a good job of not mentioning much of what happened in those specials, so that when you get there, it feels natural. Like, if you weren't buying all the books, because I was the idiot that bought everything. Same. Sitting in a box 6 feet from me right now, or all of these issues with my young, and I have them filed. not after Young Justice, but in the middle of
That's where they go. I sad to say, I did divest myself of my run of Young Justice single issues, but when I had them and I had basically it took up a short box, that's exactly where I put them as well. That's where they go.
But I just, I love these characters, man. It just reminded me of why I fell in love with Connor to begin with. And it made me want to go reread that issue where he visits the farm. And the whole subtext is just tell me. I know. I just want you to tell me. And there's a scene, I actually made a wallpaper of it for my computer, of Ma giving Clark the business about being rude. It's just
Yeah.
like, that's such a Martha Kent moment. I think he's a nice young man who's making a name for himself.
Yeah. No, I keep saying in these episodes, but I mean, poor Khan, he's just out there largely on his own. And, you know, you kind of long for him to have these moments where Superman and this people in his orbit bring him in and give him some guidance and some nurturing.
Because he's constantly bouncing from found family to found family. The thing about Steel and what separates Steel and Superboy is that one, John Henry was a grown man, and he had a family he could go home to. He had people in his life that he could lean on and depend on. Now, some of that ended up coming to bite him in the butt when his identity was revealed at the right before the Christopher Priest run. But he didn't have that problem when John Henry left. His exit from the Superman books was so ignominious. It was just like Superman and him walking down a street together and talking. You know, at least Superboy had like this big blowout.
Yeah.
But I never really thought about it until you just mentioned it. But yeah, he goes to Hawaii where he has Rex and Roxy and Tana and Double X, and then he goes to Cadmus where he has Guardian and all those characters, and then he has Young Justice and then the Teen Titans. So I didn't realize how tragic Connor Kent was, but now I can't not think of him as not a tragic character.
No, that's the thing. When we got to the end of the Superboy solo series, issue 100, when Clark finally brings his kid to the farm, it's like, thank you. But at the same time, I'm glad he had the journey that he did in retrospect. But it is one of those things like, man, it took a long time to recognize, hey, this kid needs a different kind of situation. Well, what have we not talked about with Sins of Youth that you wanted to?
There's one thing, and I forget the exact line. I should have written it down. But there is one of the characters says, these things seem to happen every 5 weeks.
Yeah.
And it just clued me into the fact that Peter David was very good about making fun of the very thing he was. We talked about it in the Young Justice 1 million issue when we did DC 1 million, that it's just all of them talking about something that happened and it's a past DC event. There's an issue of Young Justice which opens with Robin with a batarang for a hand. And it's Peter David making fun of his own writing tics through the book. And it's just, I just looked at that. I was like, yep, that's a very Peter David thing to do. But no, Sense of Youth is one of those things that surprisingly aged really well. Like, this is a period of DC Comics when you're getting into the 2000s that before the changeover in 2003, it's basically the slow death of the late 90s, where titles are just running. Most titles are just running out of steam because this forward momentum that DC had started didn't have a good endpoint. I'm not saying that Dan DiDio coming in and saying, we need to get back to all of these characters having a classic way. We need Barry. We need Hal. That's my terrible Dan DiDio impersonation, by the way.
It works.
But that's what we need. I'm not saying that was the right thing to do. But as much as I was mad that Supergirl got canceled and Young Justice got canceled, I didn't care about Titans at that time. I had long left that book. It was the right thing at the right time. The changeover was the correct thing. However, that does not mean that Young Justice is somehow inferior. because it was the one book that stayed consistently good, and that's all comes down to how Peter David shapes the titles that he writes. And ideas like adults not trusting kids and kids being left alone, and what are we going to do about these dang kids, and the other socio-political things that he brought up have not gone away. So it's odd that this book holds up well and can be read now. And yeah, there's some cultural touchstones that don't really work as well. But on the other hand, there's some great character moments. I love Cassie's mom going to talk to Arrowette's mom and basically threatening to break her arm if she slaps her kid again. I was just like, you go. I was like, that was very satisfying in the read.
Yeah. No, well said. I mean, I echo all of that. Oh, it's funny with the cultural touchstones in the first issue. Bart spray paints Hanson bites on Red Tornado. And then you have one of the reporters later who's like, hey, I like Hanson. So yeah, obviously if you're reading that in 2025, be like, I don't know who Hanson is, but yeah.
I don't know, man. That acoustic version of Mbop that came out a couple years ago seemed to ignite a bunch of 2000s refugees.
So. Oh my God, it's so funny you say it. I can't tell you how many times I've watched their their performances of that. It's so it is appropriate given the reference in Young Justice, but it's a surprisingly meaningful song. Yeah, when you actually listen, other than the Mbop part, but like when you listen to the actual lyrics, it's like, oh wow, they're actually saying something here. Justice for Hanson.
I don't know if I want to go that far, but still. But no, I really, more than anything, like talking to you is always a fun time, but it was really nice to revisit this and to not have, because sometimes you revisit stuff from the early 2000s and it's just like, oh my God, like a couple of years ago, I was part of a thing that was looking at the lead up to Infinite Crisis, not Infinite Crisis, just the lead up to it. And I was reading the Superman issues from that time. And the way they had Lois dressing, I'm like, oh, wow, that didn't age well at all.
Oh, like those Ed Bennis issues?
Yeah.
Mark Verheiden and Ed Bennis? Yeah.
But this time I'm like, okay, yeah, Todd Knox art isn't exactly modern, but it's still classic enough that I don't think it's lost anything. And yeah, some of the way the dialogue wouldn't be written that way today, but I don't think it's something that somebody who's a younger or a reader now who's never read it would go to and go, oh, this is terrible. It's not like going back and reading some of those Stan Lee early Marvel issues that, as much as we give him credit, they were not all winners.
Fair. No, I mean, I guess I have to confess, one of the reasons why I didn't revisit the entire series of Young Justice for this event was, like I said, time. Mm-hmm. And I only had a certain number of episodes that I had to really devote to this. But I'll be honest, there was also a part of me, I had so much affection and nostalgia for that series. Enjoyed it so much as it was coming out. But look, I've been reading or rereading a lot of the Superboy title, those issues, and I've enjoyed it overall, but I can't say I've been blown away. And there was a part of me that was worried if I go back to Young Justice and it doesn't live up to my memory of it, that it would ruin it. And I love it so much, and I've always held it in this special place. It's like I don't want to undermine that. So I will be honest, like that's another reason why I said, all right, like I was happy when you're like, let's just do Sins of Youth. Like, okay, good, we'll just focus on that. But I was very pleasantly surprised and really galvanized now. And I do want to go back. And to your point about the consistency, yeah, David and Nog, I mean, they're there from start to finish, those 55 plus issues. And when you get to the end of that series, I would say the biggest kind of series long question mystery pertains to the character Secret. And you get her origin over the course of the series, and you get what I think is a very satisfying payoff with her character at the end. So you really do get a satisfying story. And for anyone listening to this who's like, oh, that's a lot of issues, just read Sins of Youth. I mean, honestly, I think you can read that on its own and still have a satisfying experience. It helps, yes, if you've been reading the Young Justice issues leading into it, but you really can read it on its own. It works great.
Oh man. And the great thing about Peter David is that he will be goofy, 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 and then he'll hit you with something that's completely dark. There is a villain in the early part of the book that anybody that's watched the Young Justice cartoon is familiar with what happens. But in the comic, it's even more striking and it's more dramatic and it's more like, oh my God, that man did what he just did. And it's just like, okay, this
Yeah.
it's
Harm,
like
you
every
mean?
once in a while he reminds you, I'm not playing.
Yeah. You mean Harm?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'm really putting you on the spot here because we really just focused on Sins of Youth, but to whatever extent you remember, just the Young Justice series as a whole. This is the last question I'll pose. My memory of it is that while, of course, Superboy is present throughout the series, that there wasn't much that was really Superboy centric from the
No.
series that I remembered. Is that your memory as well? I mean, I guess other
Yeah.
than the beginnings of the relationship with Wonder Girl.
What and you know what? It's funny. What I didn't realize would come out of this rereading of Sins of Youth is I forgot how much I didn't like Wonder Girl at this time period.
Yeah, I know. I know.
Oh my God, we're having the same. I'm so glad we had the
I
same
know.
moment. No, because it's
Yeah.
not that I think everyone when they think of Cassie, they think of the Geoff Johns book. They don't think of the fact that she was part of the John Byrne run of Wonder Woman and how she wasn't really much of a character. And Peter David did as well, but what he did, the thing that stands out to me is that it is a very well balanced team. Like they all have their little roles to play. And the thing that always strikes me too, and you saw that throughout the Sins of Youth thing, is that Robin cannot appear in public with them because this is during the Batman is an urban myth, so anyone associated with Batman is an urban myth. Nightwing never got that memo, but that's a separate conversation for a separate show. So what I love about this book is how all of the characters had pretty defined personalities. And it wasn't like a teen romance book, but there was shipping within it. And then, we were introduced to Empress during this storyline, who I remember became a pretty big deal. And I forgot about Lil Lobo. I gotta tell you, I am not a fan of Lobo. Nothing against your friend.
Oh, Justin's gonna come for you now.
I think Justin and I could have a really good conversation because I will tell him the Lobo stories that I've liked.
Oh, right on. Okay.
And like that the Day of the Krypton Man Lobo Superman fight I liked. I love that Bogdanov issue where they throw down and
Yes.
have
Yeah.
the manly handshake. I'm just that character is not one that ever really appealed to me. And it's like I said, and you kind of touched on it earlier. That is not me saying that the character shouldn't exist or that other people shouldn't like them. If you love Lobo and if you cosplay as Lobo, my God, you have my respect because that's not an easy feat. I think Peter David brought him in just as if I'm remembering the series, he was there just to cause chaos. So
Yeah.
but I gotta say, it was a great last shot of the of that issue of of teenage Lobo showing up all
Yeah.
pissed off.
No, it was a fun little button because you have Clarion. He's so specific in his wording that everyone on Earth, and of course Batman's clocking this is like, what does he mean on Earth? And then you get that final page.
You keep saying the wrong. It's Clarion. Bum bum bum.
Yes, you are correct. Well, I like too that even Clarion, he has his own arc in this where Contessa
Yes.
puts him up to this at the beginning, but he ultimately agrees to help in the end because
Yeah.
Secret and Dead Boy are able to take his familiar Tikal and he wants to get back and they make a deal, but also Contessa essentially casts him out as she does her various creations at the
Yes.
agenda and whatnot. And she clones an adult version of him. And so he ultimately agrees to help. And we once again have this combination of his magic and the Doiby device. And that's how everyone is returned to normal on Earth.
But to go back to your question, the thing that stands out to me is that it was just fun. It was a fun book. It was a fun book that sometimes talked about some very hard topics. And There were clever uses of the characters, but I never got a sense that any of them in that series was not the character that was in their own books. And that's a neat trick to pull off.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad that we had this conversation and can shine a light. I know we talked about shining a light on Superboy generally, but especially on this Young Justice team, because I think these days when you say Young Justice, most people probably immediately think of the animated series.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not, I am a fan of it, although I'm still a couple of seasons behind, but I enjoyed those first couple of seasons that I watched. So, but I think a lot of people think of that. And when a lot of people think of Superboy or Superboy on a team, right, I think a lot of people are going to gravitate towards the Geoff Johns Teen Titans run, which I'm also a fan of, but we also have this, which came before and did a wonderful job for all the reasons that we've been talking about. So yeah, I'm glad we can give Young Justice its due. And while it's not our agenda here, no pun intended, but if this can spur any folks to check out that series, it's really a fun ride with a lot of heart and surprising substance, as you're saying.
And I think it speaks volumes that at no point have we mentioned the Brian Michael Bendis Young Justice series.
I'll be honest, as of this recording, I've not read it, but I'll be hitting at least some of it before this run is done. And I'm going in with, I think, pretty realistic expectations, I guess. I remember being very excited when they announced that, well, hand in hand with the Young Justice series, the fact that Connor was returning to continuity. So I remember being very excited. And I guess what I've heard of it, yeah, I don't know, left a bit to be desired. I take it did you read it in full?
I did not. I didn't touch it at all.
Oh.
I also have yet to read the Dark Crisis miniseries, which, if some of the reviews I've read, is not kind to the original at all, in places, because they tend to focus on the more negative parts of Peter David's writing ticks, which it's like one of those things, like I agree with that, but I still love the series. So I don't know how to feel right now. But yeah, no, seriously, this is when DC finally puts it on sale again. Sorry, I'm mad that there's a team up DC sale right now. Young Justice and Legion are like almost completely MIA.
Yeah, I don't know what that's about, but hey, credit where credit's due. In fairness, I know I slammed the app for their baffling gaps, but all of Young Justice is on the DC app, which is cool. And if you're on the Ultra tier, you also have digital versions of all of the collected editions. So you have a couple of different ways to read. So yeah, it is, at least on that front, it is available. So take what we can get. But Thank you so much for joining me for this. This was really, anytime we can compare notes is great. And especially something like Young Justice, where clearly we both have a lot of affinity for it. This is a perfect example. One of the reasons why I love doing this podcast, and I know you experience this with your shows as well. It's like, I've never had an hour plus long conversation about Young Justice, right? I loved it as a kid. I mean, maybe at the comic shop it came up here, but even then I don't remember this really being a huge topic of conversation. And so to finally, after all these years, to talk about Young Justice, it was very cool.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the chance to revisit it. I appreciate you asking me to be part of these series just in general. Especially with the quality of guests that you get. But no, yeah, it's I haven't talked about, I mean, eventually when FCTC starts up again, when we get to the 1998 issues, not looking forward to that. I clocked it at one point. There are over 200 Superman related books that came out in 1998.
Oh my God.
And that's going with the main books, the Prestige format series, the miniseries, Superboy, Steel, Supergirl, Young Justice, eventually JLA. It's just like I looked at it and I went, my God, what are we gonna do? But getting a chance to talk about it before that has been a lot of fun. And again, thank you for letting me be part of the Superboy series, because I really enjoyed the first two parts. The only reason I can't talk about the third part is that it hasn't come out yet.
No, I appreciate that. Oh wait, I actually had one last question for you. I didn't forget. Because while we're talking about this Young Justice series, Superboy, Robin, Impulse, and all the others, I'm aware there was, I believe it was a 2-part, I want to say prestige format miniseries called World's Finest 3. That was the initial
Yes.
pairing of Superboy and Robin.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Was it Kiesel and Grummet?
It was Kiesel and Chuck Dixon and Grummet drawing it.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. That is not on the app, and
Nope.
I'm not aware of it available in any collected edition, or certainly not one that's in print. So I don't have access to it at the moment, but I take it you read it back in the day or more recently.
I read
maybe?
it back in the day and really enjoyed it.
Okay. That's something I'll try to, that might be a little eBaying or something like that. Cause that's another one of those things. I'm sure I saw a house ad for it or something like that, but other than that, I really couldn't tell you anything about it, but I was intrigued to come across that, especially given my love of Young Justice. I was like, oh, these guys had their team up separately as well. So
yeah, and they did not get along at first.
Okay, all right. I'm gonna have to track that down. But once again, thank you, audience. I appreciate you tuning in. And Michael, I know you mentioned the projects that you have going on. Where in particular do you want to direct folks, though?
Go to fortressbailey2.com on the right-hand side of the screen, on a desktop or on the mobile app. You have to kind of flip through it. There are images that are links that take you right to the feeds. Or you can search, it all comes back to Superman Series 2 on Apple Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, and iHeartRadio.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone will check that out. And thank you again.
Thank you, sir.
Before we sign off, we have a special bonus segment with guest Scott Honig on the Titans Young Justice Graduation Day miniseries. Scott, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me back. This is, as always, a thrill. And so far, your Superboy coverage has been phenomenal. So I'm happy to add my little piece.
No, I appreciate that. And I'm really excited for the conversation we're having in next week's episode, where we are finally going to discuss the Geoff Johns Teen Titans run. But before we got to that run, and before we get to that run in our coverage, I wanted to spend a few minutes on this 3-issue miniseries from May to June 2003 by Judd Winick and Alé Garza that essentially bridged the gap between the then current Titans and Young Justice series and the Outsiders Teen Titans series that were to come. So we had this 3-issue miniseries in between that bridged that gap. Now, did you read these issues, this miniseries, when it originally came out? Yeah?
No, not when it originally came out. No, somehow I sort of missed that. I hadn't really read any Young Justice or Teen Titans. It was sort of, I was aware of it, but I wasn't big into DC at the time. So I missed it then. I ended up picking it up in a real thin, sort of floppy trade years later and actually put it on the shelf and didn't read it. And this gave me the opportunity to read it for the first time. So thanks.
Okay. Oh, I'm particularly curious then to get your take on it. So for anyone who needs a refresher or never read it, and I wouldn't be surprised, I think it's maybe relatively obscure when we're talking about this period of time. And of course, the Titans, the Teen Titans and Outsiders books to come. So the basic setup for this is we have the android we'll come to know as Indigo arriving in the present day from the future, damaged and seeking out fellow cybernetic beings to repair herself, but overdoes it, and her outreach is perceived as an attack, and this pulls in the Young Justice and Titans teams. They both happen to be in the same place at the same time. They're being pitched by the corporation Optitron that wants to sponsor these teams, so a little bit of a contrived setup in terms of how we get them both in the same place at the same time, but they end up contending with this android. Indigo eventually will make her way to Star Labs and activate one of the decommissioned Superman robots from the King of the World storyline that you and I talked about way back when. Yeah, and the teams will do battle with the Superman robot, and at the climax of the story, Donna Troy is killed in battle. So that's our basic setup for this. But yeah, I'm curious what your reaction was.
It was fine. I didn't love it, but I didn't hate it. It was fun enough. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Judd Winick's writing. I really like Alé Garza's art as well. So, you know, it was pleasing on both of those fronts. Because I hadn't yet listened to your coverage of Superboy starting all the way back at the reign of the Supermen and then all the way up to today. So I didn't have a lot of the, I don't know, the foundational knowledge because I hadn't really read much of the Connor Superboy until this Teen Titans run. So I was kind of going in blind to a certain extent, and Connor doesn't play a huge role in it. I mean, he plays a role, but he's certainly not a focal point. So I was looking for more of him. I was kind of looking at it through the Connor lens, and there wasn't much. But what I found was perfectly entertaining, I guess. What did you think? Or is this the first time you read it, or had you read it before?
No, man, I read this when it was first coming out. And I think, interestingly enough, we're talking about over 20 years. I think my impression of it essentially remained the same. It felt then and now a bit light to me. It's certainly light on the Superboy of it all, but in fairness, it has two teams to juggle, so I wouldn't necessarily expect too much of a spotlight on any one character, and that's certainly not Superboy, given that so much of this ultimately hinges on Donna Troy and that side of it. But I remember at the time, and I mentioned this previously, but I was exceedingly disappointed that the Young Justice series was getting canceled. So I already had a chip on my shoulder on that front. And the fact that it's not Peter David who shepherded the Young Justice team for 5 years and close to 60 issues. It wasn't Peter David writing this miniseries. I guess I always felt some sort of way about that, but I think I've reconciled that aspect of it because I feel this miniseries had a very specific mechanical function in terms of disbanding both of those previous teams so that we could have the Teen Titans and the Outsiders. And so I think ultimately, and this is not to sell Winick or Garza short, I think they did a fine, solid job with the task before them, but I think ultimately this miniseries was a means to an end far more than a lot of these other stories that we've been talking about. And I think it does play that way. And so as far as the Peter David aspect, there is a part of me that says, you know what, it might be for the best that he was able to wrap up the Young Justice series, I think mostly on his own terms. And I say that because the sort of series-long mystery of Young Justice had to deal with the character, The Secret, and they really wrapped that up and put a bow on it in that final issue. And so while I'm sure had Peter David been given the opportunity to fully end that series on his own terms with however many issues he wanted, I'm sure it would have played out differently, but still ultimately that felt like a satisfying conclusion. So there's a part of me that says, I think that's probably for the best that he wrapped that up. And then Winick stepped in and did this, you know?
So it sounds like you feel like it's not such an organically created story, but really something that disbanded those teams so that the Teen Titans could launch anew, so that Indigo could be introduced and she'll eventually join the Outsiders. And so Donna Troy could be removed from the table. And I think years later, they end up doing like a Return of Donna Troy miniseries that's part of the Teen Titans thing, which I have vague memories of. But I know she wasn't part of this new Teen Titans era.
Exactly.
Right? They start the new team without her.
Well, they do a whole Return of Donna Troy miniseries in the lead up to Infinite Crisis. That was one of those stories that was floating around at the time. So yes, this takes her off the board for a time, but even in this, it ends, you see her sort of in the next realm, answering the call of battle. So even from this point forward, you know, her story's not totally done. We would know that anyway, just being comic book fans. But on top of that, you have the story sort of teeing up the next chapter for her. But I guess I had laid out the plot of this, but I guess thematically what this was getting at, especially from the perspective of our Young Justice characters who will make their way over to Teen Titans. Throughout the story, they are a bit rash. They rush into battle. They don't necessarily follow the directions that Nightwing and the others are giving them. And by the end of the story, specifically with the death of Donna Troy, Wonder Girl takes it especially hard. And she's really the one who walks away from the rest of the guys there and has this whole point about how we shouldn't be doing this, right? We're not ready. We've messed this up. It's not the first time. And I think that's fine in terms of where we want the characters to be at the start of Teen Titans. Do I think it totally tracks with what we've seen over 5 years of Young Justice, where they've learned to work together and they've been through so much together? No, not really. But I feel like we had to get to this point. And in fairness, the death of a character like Donna Troy, specifically for Cassie, is enough of a catalyst where I do understand why she would be so upset with it. But yeah, overall, it did feel a bit contrived.
So I don't have the Young Justice knowledge or fandom behind me as you do. So for me, I don't see that build up to what we get here, or lack thereof, perhaps. I wonder though if we could reconcile the feelings, because this isn't just Young Justice operating. They're trying to operate with the Titans, with this older generation. And I got hints of, it wasn't explicit, but I got hints of like them trying to be their own team, separate and apart from the Titans, even though they're clearly part of the Titans tradition, and trying to show the Titans that they're more than capable. And some of the impulsiveness, I think, came through because of that. They're just trying to prove themselves because they are that younger generation. I don't know if that jives with what you're seeing, but
no, I mean, I think there's something to that. And I think that if I'm being generous and really giving the story the benefit of the doubt, no, maybe there's something in terms of that juxtaposition, that point of contrast that they're experiencing, where now it's not just them doing their Young Justice thing on their own, but now they're side by side people who have been in their shoes and have now graduated to the next level and have been their own team. And so maybe that is bringing some of these issues and frustrations to the surface in a more powerful way. And speaking of those characters, from Nightwing's point of view in particular, he steps away from the Titans because they've now suffered this terrible personal loss in the death of Donna Troy, and he doesn't want to deal with that anymore. And so his whole mandate going into the Outsiders is, this is not personal. This is all business. We're a team. We're going on missions, and that's it. And of course, that'll only last so long, but that's sort of his role in all of this as well. So like I said, I think thematically it accomplishes what it needs to. I don't know how organically we get there. It's a pretty brisk read, very action-packed. Mm-hmm. I will say, and I had forgotten this, all the business about the Superman robot, which it's one of those things. It's like, wow, they really, someone with the face and powers of Superman kills Donna Troy. And there's a great follow-up moment in the Teen Titans series where the League, the Justice League, and the Titans have come into a little bit of conflict, and they're hashing it out. And there is this discussion about guilt over Donna's death. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's Starfire though, who takes Superman to task, and she's like, you know whose fault it is? Yours. This was your robot. So I just thought that was an interesting angle. And of course, as Superman fans on a Superman podcast, it's just something that really, really jumped out at me. And I guess overall I liked it because it was a nice, unexpected follow-up to all that business with the Superman robots that we talked about with King of the World, where Superman was under the influence of the villain Dominus and was devoting himself to being a superhero 24/7 and built this army of robots to patrol. So it was just, like I said, an unexpected follow-up to that.
I agree. And I did see another connection. It's maybe a little looser, but, Connor in particular is especially impulsive when Indigo launches an attack, and he doesn't properly assess the threat, and he rushes in, and things start going wrong pretty quickly. And what was kind of nice about that, once I got into that Teen Titans run, is that later it's Connor and Indigo who are going to betray their individual teams. I'm not of their own volition, but they're the ones who are going to ultimately turn on the Titans and the Outsiders respectively. And I thought it was kind of another neat little callback to this mini series where the two of them do face off and really screw things up quite a bit.
Yeah, no, well said. I mean, other than that, I'm hard pressed to say how much more there really is with respect to Superboy specifically. But I guess just as this miniseries bridged the gap between the series, maybe this can bridge the gap a little bit between this episode and the one that we're going to have next week, because one of the things I have been wrestling with, and I posed this question in our first episode of this event, is we really do get this shift with respect to Superboy by the time we head into the Geoff Johns Teen Titans series. And we'll get into that way more next time. But I guess one of the things I've been curious to see as I revisit all of this material is the shift in Connor's personality and characterization accounted for in terms of what we see here in Graduation Day, this loss of Donna Troy, Wonder Girl's reaction to it, the disbanding of the team, and of course, what Superboy learns about himself at the end of Teen Titans #1, the fact that half of his DNA comes from Lex Luthor. And that's something I'm wondering. I don't know that I fully have my answer totally sorted out yet, but let me at least pose it to you and welcome any initial thoughts that you have, especially now having, I know you had already been totally familiar with the Teen Titans run, but now looking at this for the first time, and I know maybe this is even trickier for you because you don't have that background with the previous version of Superboy per se, but all that being said, yeah, I guess, do you see what plays out here in Graduation Day? Does that, I guess, give you more context? Does it make the Connor you meet in Teen Titans track any better?
I don't know that it makes a tremendous difference. Again, it's really hard because I'm coming at it from such a different place than you are, where, I definitely read the Reign of the Superman stuff that introduced Connor, and he is such an unformed character at that point, finding his way. And I missed the entire solo Superboy series. I mean, that's 100 issues. That's a ton of material. Plus any other appearances he'd had up until this Teen Titans series started. So for me, Teen Titans was really very much for me an introduction to Connor. And I just assumed that there was all this development over those last, 10 years or so, that I just didn't read. So I just went along with it. I'll talk more about it in next week's episode, but I actually really love the discovery that half his DNA belongs to Lex Luthor, because I think it gives him some really interesting motivations to play. I think it gives him this internal conflict that otherwise he might not have had. I think it interferes with a lot of his relationships with other members of the team and other people like the Kents who he ends up living with. So for me, no, I don't see Graduation Day necessarily as bridging the gap story-wise. I can understand why you and others who sort of read the entire Superboy oeuvre, concluded that this seemed like it was out of the blue. I've heard your surprise in previous episodes, so I know you're not a huge fan of this development. I happen to really like it. I felt like there's a lot to chew on with it.
Okay, right on. And to answer my own question about Graduation Day, do I think it accomplishes a ton for Connor personally? I mean, no, not necessarily, but it's something. It's another piece of the puzzle. And hey, credit where credit's due. They could have easily just gone from the canceled Young Justice and Titans series right over to Teen Titans and Outsiders, but they took the time to have this story in between. And like you said, it does certainly set up what's going to be paid off in the Insiders crossover a little bit down the line. So there's something to be said for that. For anyone who's not familiar with this miniseries at all and is kind of curious about checking it out, I'm sort of on the fence. I don't know that I'd really say, you go out of your way, you got to read these. But if you're intrigued enough and you have easy access to them and they are on the app, it is a pretty brisk read of this 3-issue miniseries. And especially, I would say, for those who are fans of Young Justice and or this iteration of Teen Titans, like I said, it is a piece of the puzzle, and it's something that can work either as an epilogue or a prologue to those series, despite whatever it might leave to be desired. So I appreciate you joining me for this quick segment here. Is there anything else you want to say before we sign off?
I can't think of a thing. I think we hashed it out.
All right, right on. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, audience. Make sure you come back next week. We have finally arrived at the Connor Kent era of Superboy. We're going to be digging into the Geoff Johns reinvention of the character. You don't want to miss it. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Thank you. Fat Moose Comics, established in 1982, is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Led by current owner Sean Hendricks, Moose has that rare, old-school comic shop feel and camaraderie, yet also remains a welcoming space for new fans. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you are in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. We all love the big-budget superhero films, but the world of independent cinema remains a place of unbridled creative freedom and entrepreneurial spirit. Whether you're an independent filmmaker yourself or you just love movies, don't miss these New Jersey film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, and Round Reel in Bloomfield. Submission information for filmmakers can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and much more. Support the podcast and receive exclusive content, including bonus episodes, by becoming a member at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Flat Squirrel Podcasts is home to Digging for Kryptonite and another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman. Please subscribe, rate, and review today, and continue the conversation by joining us on social media. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all